This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, everybody. You are listening to the Monday Morning Break. I'm your host, Khanh Duc Kuttig. And today we are exploring CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello there. We're broadcasting live on Monday, 9th September, and we're glad you could join us. We hope your week has been off to a good start. And if you're listening back, thank you for picking us. Thank you for choosing this episode. I promise you won't be disappointed. Now, today we're talking about content and language integrated learning, more familiar perhaps through the acronym CLIL, pronounced CLIL. And with me today, I have Patrick de Boer, a secondary school teacher based in the Netherlands. And Patrick is passionate about CLIL and has also done teacher training in CLIL. So without further ado, let's talk about CLIL, what it is and what it's not. And hello, Patrick, say hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Excellent. Very good sound quality. Patrick, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule. Tell us about yourself, Patrick, and what you do. And then, how did you get into CLIL?
Wow, so much to say. Well, thank you first for inviting me here. I'd love to talk about CLIL. I believe we only have a limited amount of time, so I'll do my best to not talk too much because I can go on forever about CLIL. As for my experience, I used to be a bilingual student myself. So in the Netherlands, we have bilingual education as a type of education students can choose. And back in 1998, we were one of the first students in the Netherlands at our school that went through that type of education. So we were, everything was tested on us. And 6 years later, I graduated and I became a math teacher. And obviously, with my background as a bilingual student, it wasn't that much of a jump to start teaching in English. And well, that was the start. And around that time, CLIL was also becoming something of more and more importance. In the beginning, it was really just about teaching in English and not so much focus on how to do that. And later on, when CLIL was introduced in the Netherlands, that was also becoming more and more important. But it was not part of any teacher training. So I decided to do some schooling in that, and really soon after started helping teachers within my school with it. And I published CLIL magazine for a while, and then people started asking, "Can you help me out as well?" And well, one thing led through to another, and now we're here almost 20 years later, still teaching again, but also helping other teachers.
You mentioned, thank you. That's really, I think, what you've done and what you've shared is very much a case of your own personal experience as a learner influencing what you do now as a teacher. I want to pick up on what you were saying about bilingual education and what that the first thing I thought when you said that you were the first cohort, the first batch of students in the Netherlands in your school to go through the bilingual program. That then, CLIL in that context is different from the students overseas who go to international schools and are taught through the medium of English. So that's EMI, that's English medium instruction. And CLIL, bilingual, means you have, right, in your local schools, you have some subjects in English and some subjects in Dutch. Is my understanding correct? Is that the model of bilingual
Yes.
education?
Yes, yes, and there is we have an organization of bilingual schools in the Netherlands, and we've got some rules and regulations we kind of set up ourselves, and then we've got an organization that checks if we live up to those expectations or up to those rules. One of the rules is there's a certain percentage, which should be higher than 50% of the lessons that should be in English, and,
Mm-hmm.
and and the majority is taught in the lower grades. So for us, that's year one, two, three, when students are 12 to 15 years old. Then I believe 80% of the lessons are in English. Obviously, not the languages, so we're not going to teach French and English, for example. But the vast majority of the subject is in English, often taught by Dutch teachers, but they speak English as well. And then the last couple of years of the education, a lot of those subjects are being taught in Dutch again because the final exams are in Dutch, and you don't want your students at the final exams to not understand the question. So to make sure that we reach that 50% in total, the vast majority of lessons is in English in the lower grades. As what you're saying about the difference with international schools, I think that that's crucial for understanding, because a lot of people think, well, immersion education, if you want to learn the language, it's good to be immersed in the language. If you want to, in my case, if I wanted to learn German, I could move to Germany and live there for a year. And of course, that would make sure that I learn a lot about the language. And that's basically the way that a lot of international schools work. There's a lot of focus, that there's a lot of English around them. But that's not the same as CLIL. CLIL is also about teachers providing support, providing scaffolding, and helping students to get to that language. So in our case, that means that the first couple of months, we will often speak Dutch still, just to get them to go to understand everything in English. Generally speaking, until autumn break, there will be a lot of Dutch, and after Christmas, they are supposed to be speaking English only. And now we're talking about 12-year-olds who often have had very little English language at primary school, and often they can already speak English quite well in a couple of months. So it's really going that fast. And for your reference, they need to be at B2, C1 level after 3 years. So that's quite a high level that we want them to achieve. And I've seen so many students achieve that. Students who told me that in January, so after about 5 or 6 months of education, that they're already thinking in English. Um, so obviously not no longer translating in their heads, which is of course very good for their fluency. And so one also told me once that they were dreaming in English, which I thought was a little creepy, but it's saying something about how what their opinion is about speaking English. It's like becoming a second nature to them. And the approach is that teachers help them with that, which is not quite the same as in immersion education, where teachers speak a second language, but not necessarily also provide a lot of language support. Does that make sense if I explain it
It,
like
it,
that?
it does. It does. So the teachers that I've had, the educators that I've spoken to who have been based or who are based in international schools, you've described it perfectly. So the students have, their regular classes: English, math, science, history, biology, all in English. But in addition to those classes, the students who need language support have separate sessions, have separate classes for language support. So their content classes are purely in English. Um, Depending on where they are, depending on who their instructors and teachers are, they may get within their their content classes, they may get support, but the aim is to teach the subjects, to teach those content subjects in English. And I suppose you can't provide that full on language support in those content classes because the students, the pupils, come from such different backgrounds and have such different levels of English, right? So they're taken out, or they're given additional hours of English language support, and they then fall under the group of learners of English as an additional language. Whereas in bilingual education, and you'd have that, that's quite similar in the German system. I think our only comparisons for today would be the Dutch system and the German system, where the students are learning school subjects in English alongside regular English classes. They're all, from the same class or from the same year group. For example, my daughter is in a bilingual pathway in school. We don't call them bilingual schools. We have bilingual pathways. So she would have, this year is her third year in the pathway, and she has politics, geography, and history in English. um, Students who are not on the bilingual pathway in her school have those three same subjects in German in the medium of education here. And as part of, you know, those sessions in politics, geography, and history in English, they also learn language. So they're learning, let's say they're learning passive constructions, but talking about geography rather than
Yeah,
in a regular language class, right? You'd have passive constructions and very inauthentic examples of the language, but you'd have language in authentic use, is what I would say, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's and I think that's a common misconception I think about CLIL, that it's subject teachers teaching in a second language, but it's also language teachers using that content. So my and by the way, that just to make sure that we're on the same page there, bilingual schools in the Netherlands also often offer the Dutch stream. So it's not that like it's bilingual only. I believe there's two schools in the Netherlands that are bilingual only, but the
Hmm.
other 120, 130 schools offer both the bilingual and the Dutch pathway, as you call it. But for example, if I would teach my students maths in English, my English language colleague might very well use examples from my math lessons or from geography or from history to explain. So, for example, a great example would be that if a teacher explains about the past simple, instead of taking out the English language book, and as you said, the not per se best examples there, they can take the history book and ask the students, you see, you have already been using the past tense, and let's talk about it a bit. And so where do you see that? And then they all of a sudden realize, oh, it's not like we get English as a separate subject, but it's part of what we learn, and it's important to see those links. And we are learning this for a reason, to better understand history, geography, and all the other subjects. So I also, whenever I talk with teachers and I ask them this, okay, so when do you talk about the past tense and have they had history by that time? Often the answer is yes. Well, then there's a lot of possibilities there to combine that instead of constantly just taking those English language course books, which are, well, there are really good ones out there, but there's also a few of them that I think are using examples that I think, are those the things you want your students to learn, or do you want them to actually see what they can do with the language? And CLIL, within the context that we use it, provides so many opportunities for that.
I like what you said there, that CLIL provides so many opportunities for them to use the language. And I think that's what we want, really, isn't it? I mean, you're probably familiar with the English language learner, the EFL learner in your context. I've got in my context where um, kids go to school and they have English as a subject. And I meet so many parents or other kids who then say, as they would say in German, well, our English lessons are just rubbish, you know, and there's just no motivation for them to do better, or they cannot make connections, right? They cannot make connections. There are some structures that are taught because they're in the syllabus, they're in the curriculum, they're in the textbook. And yes, our textbooks, many textbooks now are aligned to the common European framework, so you've got these can do statements. But nonetheless, if the student does not have an interest in whatever the theme or the topic is in the language textbook, whatever structure or vocabulary you teach them isn't going to stick, right?
No,
But if you,
if there's no context, if there's no reason why, then I understand students have a hard time being
yeah,
motivated. Whereas if they see,
exactly.
oh, wait up, I can use this, or I have used this and I can already do this a bit, or I recognize it, and they can link it to previous, hopefully, success experiences,
Yeah,
and
and that's
that will
what.
help them to be motivated.
Exactly. So if we have the example with the passive, and you're doing geography and you're talking about the water cycle. Is that what it's called? The water cycle, the rain cycle, water.
Hmm. Hmm.
I see at the moment is the picture of the clouds and the water and those arrows. But because they're learning about the water cycle in a subject called geography, and they're learning about it through a different language, a language that they're learning as well, right? They can make the connections. It click, as one would say,
Yeah,
in German, it clicks then, because it's like, all right, so we're
yeah.
using the passive to describe this cycle, because the agent is not important and we're focusing more on the process, etc., etc.
And
um
I think what you said you used the word passive there, and I have to think about what the passive is. I'm not a trained language teacher. I know how to provide feedback on language in math class. If a student says tree instead of three, I'll draw a tree, and we'll talk about how you pronounce that. But don't ask me to explain what a passive simple is or something like that. Present perfect, those kind of things. I'm not a trained language teacher, but that allows for those possibilities. I can give my English language colleague the context of my lesson. If they ask, okay, I want to do something with passive, I'll just hand them my book and say, well, if there's something in here that you can use, let me know, so I can also discuss it in my class. But we need each other. We can help each other with that, and it creates for the English language teacher. They have a vast database almost of ideas and lesson materials, because they can walk towards almost every colleague and ask, okay, I want to do this. Where are your students at right now in your subject? Maybe I can take something from your lesson. And for the language, the subject teacher is also great, because then they know, okay, there's a little bit of attention to language in this particular topic or this particular area. Especially geography teachers, well, the more language heavy subjects, history, geography, those teachers often feel like language teachers the first couple of months, because they need to explain and translate every third word in a sentence, because students, some of them come in with very limited English background. And then it helps if the English language teacher takes some of that and says, well, I'll focus on the language part of the book, you focus on the content part, and then they can work together again. So that just, as I said, it allows for so much more than just translating your lesson. There is that overlap with the English language teacher, if done correctly. Obviously, I'm sketching a bit of an ideal scenario. I know it's not always happening like this, but that's yeah, it's something to aim for.
That's really interesting what you just said there. And I just asked myself, how do I not know this? That you're not a trained language teacher. Oh my goodness, I'm shocked. I can only gasp. Um, I'm sure you said it to me years and years ago. And that's really interesting, um, because in Germany, the teachers who teach on a bilingual program have to be trained English teachers, as well as, well, obviously, qualified to teach the other subjects. So have a person who's trained as an English and geography teacher, or an English and history teacher, and then you could then um, qualify to teach on the bilingual program. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's not the
yes.
case in the Netherlands. We do have to have an English certificate, so we do have to have our C1, C2 certificates, so either
Hmm.
Cambridge or Anglia, whatever. So you do have to show that you have a certain level of English. Um, but it's not that you have to go back to school to become an English language teacher. Um, uh, so no, it's just that I don't think we would have enough enough teachers for the bilingual stream if we would do that, because we have huge shortage of teachers as well. So often it's really when a teacher says, well, I want to teach in a bilingual stream, they get trained, they get classes for the English language and they have to do the exam. But that's purely for their own mastery of the language, not so much about teaching a language. So it's not about being able to explain the grammar rules, um, which I think also is not really necessarily, because we already have experts in school on that topic. It's just a matter of collaborating more. And that's easier said than done, I have to be honest.
That's an interesting point. You're right. That's an interesting point. What you're saying there about not necessarily having to teach. I would just say, I would call it the complexities or the basics of language. You just, I think, need to have enough knowledge, as you do seem to have in the Netherlands, where the bilingual teacher, the teacher who teaches a content subject in English, should have, well, obviously that level of English, C1, C2, plus some knowledge of the complexities of language, that they can identify when students are using structures incorrectly, some pedagogical knowledge on how to work, with vocabulary acquisition and other processes in language learning. But before we look at the complexities of teaching content and language, here is this week's education news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK. Home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the programme with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Exclusion rates are in the news again, with BBC North East and Cumbria focusing on a study which says North East England will continue to have the highest rate of children being excluded and suspended from schools. According to research by think tank IPPR and charity The Difference, Redcar and Cleveland, Middlesbrough, Hartlepool and Newcastle are amongst the highest in the area for exclusion rates. The report highlights a direct link between deprivation in the region and high suspension and exclusion figures. Middlesbrough Council responded by saying it was a trend we are determined to reverse. Middlesbrough's exclusion rate is 28.1% and is 3 times the national average, with Redcar and Cleveland's even higher at 32.7%. The research concludes that the correlation between poverty and exclusion would make regional divides harder to tackle. Others pointed to lack of resources, specialist staff, and a lack of freedom with curriculum as further pressures schools and pupils face. A spokesperson for the Department for Education said the rising numbers were shocking and showed the massive scale of disruptive behaviour that has developed in schools. The spokesperson went on to say the Department for Education was committed to providing access to specialist mental health professionals in every school and ensuring earlier intervention in mainstream schools for pupils with special needs. The Guardian has more details on the figures across England on its website. In Northern Ireland, schools are being advised to restrict pupils' use of mobile phones during the school day. Education Minister Paul Givan issued new guidance which also applies to limiting use at break and lunch times. He said there was a growing evidence that phones distract children from learning. He also said the guidance would allow teachers to do what they do best, teach. Mr. Given pointed out that many countries across the world are increasingly taking steps to stop phone use at school, and that the new guidance would allow schools in Northern Ireland to be fully aware of the latest evidence and practical advice. The guidance is being accompanied by a pilot of phone-free solutions, including inviting expressions of interest from schools to use pocket-sized pouches which phones will be placed in. The pouch is then closed by using a magnetic latch. UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Science body, has also previously advised that smartphones should be banned from schools. The previous guidance to schools in Northern Ireland on mobile devices was 8 years old and mainly focused on possible educational uses of phones. In a week that has seen the announcement of the abolishment of 1 or 2 word inspection grades, as well as other changes to Ofsted inspections, the Church of England has released a report which highlights the positive impact of moving away from such gradings. The annual SIAMS inspection report, which can be found on the Church of England website, outlines key recommendations to support continuous improvement in church schools. The report reveals what it calls a smooth transition away from single word grades to a more compassionate, contextual approach to accountability. Under the new framework, over 99% of SIAMS inspections in the last academic year were described as less stressful but more robust. This is a contrast to the BBC's reporting that Ofsted's response to a head teacher's suicide following a school inspection was defensive and complacent. Dame Christine Gilbert's independent review was commissioned after an inquest into the death of Ruth Perry. Ofsted's Chief Inspector, Sir Martin Oliver, accepted most of the review's findings. The findings come after the government scrapped the overall gradings for inspections. Further details of the review can be found across media outlets. Schools Week reports that Ofsted has named the members of 7 new external reference groups that will offer independent advice and challenge as it embarks on reforms. The groups will meet 3 times a year and between them will discuss and challenge Ofsted's data, research and evaluation plans and act as expert advisors on their specialities. They will also advise on any proposed developments and give advice on aspects of training relating to leader and staff well-being. The full list of members can be found on the Schools Week website, but they include recognisable names such as Chris Patterson from the Education Endowment Foundation, Claire Seeley from the States of Guernsey, and Matt Hood of Oak Academy, who will be focusing on curriculum. The Behaviour and Attendance Group includes Tom Bennett of Research Ed and Catherine Roper from Wiltshire Police, as well as Sarah Clark from the National Network of Parent Carer Forums. Other reference groups will focus on inclusion, well-being of leaders and staff, early years and social care, and insights and education. Finally, a US court has charged a father in relation to a school shooting allegedly committed by his 14-year-old son. The gun attack resulted in the death of 4 people at a school in Georgia. The 14-year-old is charged with 4 counts of murder, whilst his father is charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter and child cruelty. They are the most severe charges brought against a parent after a school shooting, and the judge in the case told the 54-year-old father he could face up to 180 years in prison. He is accused of allowing his son to possess an AR-15 style rifle, which is alleged to have been used in the attack. The case has again prompted discussion about gun laws, school safety, and the responsibility of parents for the criminal actions of their children. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
So, welcome back, everybody. For those of you who are here live with us, if you have any questions about CLIL, please put them in. Send us a note, send us a message, and Patrick will happily answer those questions. Do join the discussion. So we have been talking, we were actually just laying some background. Patrick's been telling us about the Dutch system, and I've shared some of my limited insights into the bilingual system here in Germany. And we wanted now to look at the complexities of teaching content and language. And one thing that we discovered from our conversation prior to the news was that in the Dutch system, the teacher who was teaching the content subject in English would not necessarily be a pre-qualified, pre-trained English language teacher, whereas in the German system, a bilingual teacher would have been trained as a teacher of English plus that other subject. For example, the most common subjects that are taught in the bilingual pathway in Germany are biology, geography, history, and politics. Those are the four. So, Patrick, please tell us what a typical bilingual pathway in the Dutch system looks like. Do they just suddenly, first year of secondary school get 3 subjects? I mean, you talked about percentages and things like that, but how does it look like, really?
Well, that means that we have bilingual education often at secondary education. So students enter a school at 12-ish,
Mm-hmm.
and then they have loads of subjects in English. English, of course, history, geography, biology, um, maths, science. I think almost every subject that they have is in English except for the languages, and sometimes a subject that's not taught by a bilingual teacher. It happens a bit at some the schools can decide what subjects to teach in English as long as they get to that certain percentage. But most schools offer as many as possible because you want students to have that bilingual experience. And that lasts for about 3 years. So for 3 years, they go through the bilingual experience, and then after 3 years, some subjects are being taught in Dutch again to prepare for the exams, as I said. And that means that when they start at year one, a lot of them know very little English. Nowadays, there's more schools offering more English, but that used to be a time when some students would enter the school knowing yes, no, and a few bad words in English, and that would basically be it. And then immediately going into a bilingual stream, that will be a bit of a challenge. So often whenever I would be teaching in first grade, I would start off in English and then, rephrase a bit of the things in Dutch again. And that way gradually get them to a level that I don't have to constantly translate anything anymore. And that's only a period of 2 months. So no more, it's not like we do that for years. And
Well,
students
that's
struggle with that for a
really
while, but I've done this for 15, 16 years, and students always get to that level.
that's really exciting because it's like literally throwing them into the hot water. It's absolutely here, do that. Right. I mean, if it's anything to go by in Germany, also when they come out of primary school and go into secondary school, their English would be, say, post A1, right? But I
Mhm.
mean, you say Dutch kids know very little, so yes, no. But that immediate immersion, I think that's what sets Dutch young people apart from Germans. I hear all the time people say, "Oh, the Dutch they speak much better English than we do." I was at a conference at the weekend, and I was talking to somebody who'd done a virtual exchange. So this person is based in Germany, and she'd done a virtual exchange with somebody in Rotterdam, and she was saying, in her opinion, it didn't work so well because the German students were a lot weaker and the Dutch students were a lot stronger, so they weren't evenly matched. And I
Mhm.
think that kind of explains it. What's interesting, what you said, and you said it earlier, is that so they do 3 years of lots of subjects, they get the bilingual experience, but after that, for their final assessment, for their high school leaving, they get these same subjects then in Dutch, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because they
They
have to
still
be
get a few
assessed.
subjects in English, but and
Mhm.
often because the English level is already at the level that they have to be at in 3 years' time, they get international baccalaureate as a subject.
All
So
right.
there is that advanced level of English, and there is the challenge of English that way to make sure that they don't get bored, and they get international baccalaureate, international recognized I went through that process myself as well. I also got those certificates. So that's the way to make those upper 3 years also challenging. And there's a few subjects they still can do in English, but the ones that are, well, we've got central examination. So one test for everyone in the Netherlands for specific levels. And those are the subjects we do not teach in English anymore, because you
Because
don't
they're
want
assessed
they
in Dutch.
yeah, and they are being we can't translate that,
Yeah,
because we only get those exams 2 minutes before the exams start, because they're all secret. So
yeah.
there's no way we could translate that ourselves. And there has been quite a bit of talk about maybe getting our students to do that as well, but then you would also need more teachers teaching in the higher upper streams, which are often already teachers that need more qualifications. So then the teacher shortage is an issue. And you also run into issues when it comes to checking, because we have a system where all tests are checked by your own teacher and a teacher from another school. That's quite a logistic nightmare, if you can imagine. But if you also need to add a second language to that, then it's almost undoable. So organizational wise, I think it's a good decision. Motivational wise, I can imagine that some students think, why should I bother, continuing if my exams are in Dutch again? But luckily, there's a lot of other things they also do in upper grades, like the international baccalaureate. And often there's also international internship and a lot of other things that are organized to focus a bit more on that internationalism and make sure they keep up their level of English, and often get to a C1, C2 level by the end of 5 or 6 years, which is, of course, really high. And
That
as you
is very
mentioned, a lot of
high.
Dutch people have quite a high level of English, but I'm not saying that every student ever went through bilingual education, of course. It's a stream students can choose.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Netherlands, we tend to speak English a lot, especially when students get older. There's, unlike, for example, France or Italy or Germany, we do not dub a lot of our movies. We sub them,
Yeah.
so there is English that they hear and they read the subtitles. A lot of English music, a lot of games are published in English and not translated into Dutch. So students are already in touch with the English language a lot around them, and that way it's probably easier for teachers also to get them to a certain level. So I think part of the reason a lot of Dutch people know quite okay English, um, although sometimes it's more Dutchlish. But they seem to be okay in English because they hear so much English around them. And then
Yeah,
then,
it's
then
the
the situation
exposure.
the exposure. And as I said, there was a time when there weren't a few kids came into the secondary school with very little English. I see that there's a change happening, and there's a lot more students now who have quite a decent level of English. But still, of course, it's A1, A2, so you have to raise that. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, what you're saying. Everybody I speak to who knows anything about Dutch, the Dutch education system, or Dutch people speaking English, it's the first thing they say as well. It's none of our TV shows are dubbed. It's like, and I remember that. But we are digressing. We are digressing. We could have a whole new show about the level of English across Europe. But let's not do that. Um, you talked about kids coming in with very little English, and then within 2 months they're just there, they're in it, and they're hopefully enjoying learning these new subjects in a new language, or in a different language. Share with us, please, some of the top strategies. I tell my own students who are training to be teachers, I say you always need a bag of tips and tricks, and you need to have strategies that work. You don't go to university and learn 57 different strategies and use them without thinking. So you're a math teacher. Let's start with subjects like that, like math, science, whatever else. What are some strategies that you use, that have been helpful in the bilingual classroom, apart from occasionally using Dutch to get through
Yeah.
the lesson?
Yeah. No, I think I think it's a very important addition, because you don't want to constantly translate, because you don't want them to translate. You want them to start thinking in English. So one of the things I often do is, well, there's a lot of reciprocal teaching. So asking students, what did we learn before? At the end of the lesson, they have to call back. So there's a lot of times I make them use language. I don't think you can learn a language by reading about it. You need to practice it. So and that's also my way of implementing CLIL. Students are the ones who always need to do the work. So they're always writing, they're always producing language. Doesn't mean they're always talking, but they're always writing and making sure that there's language out there. And that's, keeping up that practice, making sure that they constantly do that. For example, instead of just asking to calculate things, I will also ask them to explain things in their own words. So the first, I always have opening questions at the beginning of my lesson, so they have some time to activate prior knowledge. One of those questions is always about a word or phrase from a previous lesson, and I simply ask them, okay, in your own words, can you explain what this is? And if I want to make it even more challenging, I will ask them, okay, can you explain this in 10 words or less? Giving that word limit there forces them to think into synonyms or use other words. So that's, I'm clarifying the assignment there, making it even more language focused. I'm still focusing on maths. It's a mathematical phrase I want them to explain, but I want them to practice using that language.
Can you give
Um,
us an example of a question? I mean, when you said that, a question came to my mind, and I know very little math. I know enough to make sure, my bank balance is acceptable. Um, the first kind of question that came to mind for me is, what is a fraction? Is that a kind of question you'd be asking them? Because after I formulated that in my head, I was like, how would I explain what a
yeah,
fraction was?
yeah. Well, that's good that you mentioned. I mentioned scaffolding before. The key here is to get students to know how to say things. So I might just ask them to try it on their own, but I can also give them some sentence starters so they know, okay, this is how I want the sentence to start. Or I might even give them a sentence with gaps so they only have to fill in the gaps. So providing a lot of structure there for them to be able to explain those things in their own words. Just an example of a lesson last week. The question I asked was, explain your own words. What's the difference between -5 squared with brackets and -5 squared without brackets? You can use an example, but I also want you to be able to explain it. That was, and that's a topic we discussed the lesson before. But I might even ask them, okay, what's another word for brackets? Because it's not
Oh,
really the
wow.
official phrase. It's parentheses officially. And then we talk a bit about how you pronounce that because it's a very annoying word to pronounce.
I thought
But
parentheses was, sorry to interrupt, I thought parentheses was just the American term for
yeah,
brackets.
yeah. There's different ways of saying that.
Phew.
But I also see them in English literature sometimes. It's a bit, I'm not from England, I'm not from America, so sometimes it's confusing for me as well. Some of the things I know, okay, this is typically American, this is typically British, but it's not always that clear. And the students also get confused sometimes, of course, but it doesn't always say whenever they read something where it's from. So I need them to know the different words meaning the same thing. But for example, when we talk about geometry, we also talk about quadrilaterals.
Yeah.
That's a phrase they hear in the second or the third week when they just entered school, and it's a very difficult word because in Dutch you just say four-angled shape, literally,
Yeah,
vierhoek.
yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah,
but
in
in
German
English you
as
use,
well. German,
yeah.
Viereck.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. But then in English, it's all of a sudden a quadrilateral. So we talk a bit about the fact that, quad is in there and they all know what a quad is. So we can talk about that and I make them say it out loud. But that's the way I focus on language in my math class as well. And the example I used earlier, whenever a student says tree, I draw trees. Um, just to make them aware of the fact that they should say three. It gets really annoying when they talk about dirty trees when they mean 33. Then that's when I focus again on you're saying it wrong, and I try to draw a dirty tree, but I'm not that good at it. I don't have awesome drawing skills.
Oh,
But
that's
that's basically what
hilarious.
I do, constantly focusing on the language aspect and not only on the maths aspect. Of course, I make them calculate things, but then afterwards, constantly rephrasing it in their own words, finishing sentences, etc.
It's very uh, problem based is not the right word, but it's like you're teaching math in any other English language setting, but where you're learning the subject, but at the same time you're learning to process your knowledge about the subject in English. I was going to say something really smart, but I've forgotten what it was. um, oh yes, I remember now. It wasn't anything smart, actually. It sounds like quite stupid now that I'm going to say it. But my question is, do you or any other teachers that you know who teach any of these other subjects through the medium of English, do they get students to keep vocabulary lists? I ask because vocabulary lists are very popular in Germany amongst the teachers, not the students. So my child who's in the bilingual program, one of her previous teachers had them just right. It was in geography, and she had, words on one side that were all in German, and then the equivalents in English. Is that something that you recommend, or do you feel that there's a different way for students to acquire and learn these subject terminology in English?
No, I think PIFs, personal idiom files, which I think is about the same thing, can be very important if done correctly. It doesn't work if you give them a word list. We have often, for example, they have books that are translated, not always in the best way, and in the back of the book there's word lists where they, have the translation there. That's not what you want. You don't want students to translate. So instead of doing that, I ask them, okay, read this piece of text, or read this paragraph, or read this chapter, and find words that you don't understand. Look at the keywords. And make a list of keywords that you don't understand. And then while we go through this, when we go through the text or the chapter or whatever, write in a description of what you think the word is, and check with your neighbors. And I sometimes plan for time for that. And then I also walk around and check those PIFs if I want to. I think key there is the personal part. So some students will have written down a lot of words, and others will know more English, so they write down less words, which is fine. Of course, I also have students who say, well, I know every single word in there. I just give them some scrambled words then to find, which I know are keywords, and they probably, need some time to figure that out. Again, focusing on language again. But some schools organize this really well. So students have a separate notebook with their PIFs, and they use it for different subjects. And some schools don't. So it matters a bit on how well schools implement this, and also how well teachers implement this. Because as a school, you can have a really good idea, but if teachers don't implement it because they don't know how, or they're not facilitated, or they don't see the relevance, then it doesn't happen. So it's important to talk with your teachers about why you do this, and why it can really help students. And some of them probably won't need it. But others, if you at the end of a chapter say, well, go back to your word list that you created at the beginning of this chapter, and review it again. Do you have any words still there without a description? Do you know them now, and why? Because that way you can, again, constantly review those difficult words. I think it's very important that you do that every now and then, but really focus on what the student themselves find tricky. And if you just say, well, here's a list of difficult words and you need to study this or something, that has a certain passiveness to it that I don't think will help students who really need it, because they just see, oh, there's so many new difficult words, I'm not never gonna be able to do this. If there's one thing that helps for motivation, it's success experience. And if they write down some words they find difficult, and already during the first lesson they hear some of those words and they can write down and they realize, now I understand it, then they are immediately more motivated to work with that language. I get the feeling I'm deviating from the
No, no,
question a bit.
no,
Did
no.
I answer the question?
You did. I mean, what you're saying definitely, and the word, what I picked up on was what you're saying about passive learning, right? I mean, here's a word list, or one thing that's really popular, and I don't understand why. You have a textbook, and at the back of the textbook, there's this German English word list, and the teacher says to the student, I want you to write down the words from page 285, from the word house until the word fish. And that's what the kids would go and do, right? And they'd write it out in a separate vocabulary book, little exercise book. I can understand the rationale that when you're writing something down, you may tend to remember it better, but it's passive learning because they don't come back to it. And what kids tend to do also is that, that's just teaching to the test. The children will just learn those words for the next vocabulary test. And but what you've done, for example, what you've described with the math question and how you scaffold their ability to explain things in English, where you either give them a prompt, or what I like was with the gap fill text, right? Where they're then using the language, right? They're using the new vocabulary, or, what you've described with the PIF, the personalized, what does it stand
Idiom
for?
file.
Idiom
Personalized,
file,
yeah,
right?
personalized idiom
That
file.
that's amazing, because it helps students take responsibility for their own learning, and it's personalized exactly as the intention is, so that each individual student can decide how much, where they can recognize for themselves where their knowledge gap is, and the fact that they're going back to it and reviewing it makes them responsible also for their own learning. So
And
you've
that's the
got the
reciprocal
personal.
teaching that I was
Yeah,
talking about. Yeah, so constantly going back and forth and reversing things. If you just ask them to copy things, yes, if you make them write things down, they remember things better. There's a lot of research that shows that. But that also research often also says it's about remembering things and writing them down, and not literally just copying, because then there's nothing happening when it comes to remembering. You need to actively retrieve that information from somewhere, and
exactly.
that's when learning happens. Another
Yeah,
take on this, by the way, if you really want to work with word lists, is to give them a partial word list. So, for example, with only one of the two words filled in, and then with the starting letter, or not a translation, but a description, and then they have to fill in the word, or the other way around, a word and then a description that starts with a certain letter. So you scaffold the structure. So then again, there needs to be some thinking when they fill in a word list, instead of just you doing the work and creating a word list for them or printing it for them, because then they have not invested any effort in it, and it's less likely they will be using it.
yeah. Exactly. What you want is active learning strategies,
Yeah,
and what students do a lot, or end up doing, if not, if they're not taught well, or yeah, if the teacher doesn't really want to put a lot of effort into the teaching, what students will just be doing is copying things down. I know it from my own children. They copy it down once and they never go back to it. They never go back to it, because their rationale is, well, I've written it down, but unless you want to write it down 27 times back and forth in German and English, you're not going to know it. And if you don't want to do that multiple times, then you want to have other activities where your learning, your memory is activated. Now,
yeah.
before we talk about assessment, which is something that I'm quite interested in, assessment in a CLIL context, let's just listen to these messages again.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Introducing Reading Solutions UK, home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Future Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
Yes, so we're back. We're just at the last stretch of our show, and I wanted to talk about assessment. Now, Patrick, how and what would one assess then in a CLIL class test, or how can you see that learning has happened? What kind of summative or formative assessment do you have, or what's ideal?
It's a rather broad question if you include formative assessment, because formative assessment, I think, happens every lesson in one way or another. But if you talk about summative assessment, so really the test itself, I test maths. I'm a math teacher. So the way that I teach is obviously through a second language. And for students to understand the questions, they need to have mastered a certain level of English. But I use the same tests as my Dutch colleagues, only translated in English, because that's the thing I need to test primarily. I'm a math teacher first, language teacher second. So that's really what I focus on. What I will look at sometimes, if there is, for example, a context-based problem, I will check, is there any word in here that we didn't discuss because we need to discuss this specific context and that students might struggle with, because then I will maybe add a translation of that word, because I don't want the language to be a barrier for their maths. But we only have a very limited amount of summative tests a year, 5 or 6. It's really way more about formative assessments. So constantly checking with students, how are we faring? How do we do? Recently, I've started using the fingers of a hand to show me what they think the answer is. So I ask a question, I give them 5 possible answers, which of course I thought of beforehand. And I know, well, if they make this thinking mistake, they will end up with that question or this answer. And I just give them some thinking time, because the language is there, so they need a bit more thinking time. I count down to 0, and then they all raise their hands, and I can immediately see who scores what and if they understand or not. And then I can go from there. But that's also checking if they understand the question, right? Because then that's also when I focus on language. So if they don't understand the question, they can't answer it. So I constantly focus on that, but I don't test what their language level is in any test. That's what my English language colleague does, because that's not my job. Does it answer your question?
It does answer my question, and I mean, after I asked it, and then when you responded, your first response, my immediate reaction to myself was duh. Right? Yes. Math is different. Math is very different, and I suppose they can only do well in a summative math test if they've understood the content, which had been taught in English. So yes, duh. But just to rescue myself a little, you have totally answered my question, but just to rescue myself in a little, how can you tell in a summative assessment, as a final class test, for example, that a student has done poorly? Okay, now this just sounds stupid. A student has done poorly because of lack of language. I
Yeah.
mean,
No,
you
it's not a
would,
strange question at all, because it's something we struggle
let's
with.
say
Um,
if you have,
yeah.
sorry, let's say if you had a question like, the train travels in direction A at a speed of and a train from the opposite direction travels at a speed of and when do they meet, blah blah, that kind of question, right? A text, in German we call it a text question.
Yeah.
And how can you tell if a student has struggled with that question because of a language problem as opposed to because of a math problem, not knowing how to calculate it?
Yeah. First of all, I think this is a very good question because it's something that we all still struggle with. It's very hard to distinguish, to know where the mistake comes from. Um, One way to tackle this is really looking at the language in a context and checking if there's any new language there. So you, as a teacher, you're responsible there as well. It also has to do with the type of questions you ask. This is indeed a typical type of question that we always include in tests, but only very limited. And there's also percentages that tell us how much to include of this, so to make sure that you don't only ask this type of question. Also responsibility of students. So students, if they during a test find the context to be a barrier, they're always allowed to ask. Doesn't necessarily mean that we will answer the question, but they can ask. And then afterwards, when you have a test discussion, I also ask them to identify the type of mistake they made. And one of the types might be, I didn't understand the question, there was a language barrier. So that's a way to also for me to receive feedback. If one question, if with one question, a lot of students tell me the language was a problem here, then we need to keep, then we did a bad job creating the test, because it should not be the case that the language is a barrier for maths. However, the text itself, being able to take information from a text or a piece of information, that's the tricky type of question anyway. Not despite when you're teaching, if you're teaching in bilingual education, Dutch students also find that tricky to filter out important information. So sometimes it's not so much the language as it is the skill to identify what information is relevant or not. And that's something we practice with again in class. I help them to identify what's relevant or not. And sometimes it is challenging to know, is this language or is just the skill that's not has not been trained enough. Honestly, I think with maths we're a bit lucky because we don't really have that too often. Obviously, there's a lot of calculations going on. If you teach history or geography, which are more language heavy, you run into this issue, I think, a lot more, that they might not understand words, or that they really have to study some words for them to understand and the test. And if they then didn't study enough, that they just don't understand the question. So yeah, you can run into that. But I think with maths, the problem is a little less, because even if they don't know the phrase, they might be able to calculate it.
Yeah. And would you, before I compare that with history, geography, biology, other language heavy subjects, in math, or let's say somebody who was doing it in chemistry and it's all, formula based and problem solving, if a student had to write an answer in a sentence or in a phrase, and they'd made some language errors, but their, say, final calculation was correct, or they spelled fraction with a sh rather than a t, would they be penalized? Is there a case for penalizing for language, or would this be overlooked?
This is something I talk a lot with a lot of teachers about a lot, and the general consensus is that we do not penalize, because if I give a math test, I want that grade to show me what their level of maths is, and I want to test maths and not their language. So if they make spelling mistakes and I start subtracting points for that, what does the grade for maths tell me then? Because it's not just telling me their maths mastery anymore. It's also telling me something about spelling or grammar or whatever, but I don't know what ratio, and that differs per student. So that kind of makes the grade itself a less clear um,
Representation.
a representation. Thank you. Yeah, that was the word I was looking for, of their skills. So yes, we might talk about this when we review the test. I sometimes make a list of the top 5 common mistakes, and I hand those out again without names. We're not doing naming and shaming, but I do want them to see, oh, this is a mistake I've often seen, and we talk about that. And it might very well be also spelling errors. I sometimes joke with students that, for example, with quadrilateral, and I will tell them, well, that's going to be a test, a question or test, where I will ask you to spell it. and if everyone spells it correctly, I'll treat. That I make a bit of a joke about it. But generally speaking, I want no language questions in the test, and I also don't want to check that. But I will keep an eye on it. If I see that certain mistakes are done more often than others, I will discuss that later on. But I don't want it to be reflected in any type of grade, because disqualifies the importance of grades. As I said, we only have 5 or 6 summative tests a year, so you want those to be showing their math skills and not their language skills.
And how would that be? Does your opinion remain the same, say, for subjects that are language heavy, like history or geography, or politics? Do you think, well, I mean, what's a history skill? What's a politics skill, right? In those subjects, it's more about learning content and understanding how things connect, events connect to each other and things like that. So they use language. Students use language to demonstrate their knowledge and to show their critical thinking abilities. So do you think more attention is being paid to the language part in assessment in these subjects?
Yeah, but I think the things you just described are indeed the things you want to test on a summative test. So being able, if you get 2 texts and analyze that, and they have to say something about both texts in a certain context, for example, in history, then that's the skill a history teacher wants to see. And if they can describe it well, they probably score points. But the history teacher, at least in my opinion, and what I hear other teachers say as well, is not going to check, did you spell it correctly, or did you make a grammar mistake somewhere? So they will be using language, and they will, if they make the correct links or if they describe it correctly, then they score their points. But if they make a writing error, that it's not going to subtract any points. So it's not, which might be the case if they get a test from an English language teacher who basically tells them, well, this is the vocab for this particular topic, and they really have to focus on how to spell it, then an English language teacher might do that. By the way, this is also something, again, when we talked about collaboration before, but this is also something that's being done sometimes where the teachers collaborate. So they give a shared task to students, and then the history teacher or economics teacher or whatever checks that their part, and they get a grade for that. And the English language teacher checks the English component and checks the spelling and those kind of things, and they get a grade for that. But then for the English language and not for the subject. So that way you keep the criteria, they get checked for both things, but they get separate grades to make sure that the grades themselves show what you want to test.
Yeah, so the grades are reflective, isn't it? The grades should be reflective of the learning objectives. And I suppose that's why it's called content, with content being in front, content and language integrated learning, rather than language and content integrated learning. By putting content in front, I suppose it reflects that content is the focus rather
Yeah,
than
well,
than the
I do feel I'm
language.
a content language first and a language teacher second.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to talk for David Marsh and Do Coyle as to why they made that, and why they decided to write it like this. Although I have to say, CLIL is easier to say than LIL or something like that. So I'm assuming that might have something to do with it as well.
Okay, that's hilarious. Patrick, we've come to the end of our time, but before we go, please, one piece of advice for any CLIL teacher, or maybe, your hopes and wishes for for Europe in bilingualism and in CLIL education. Your last words.
Okay, 2 things. One practical, one hopefully more inspirational. If you're in doubt and not sure if what you're doing is CLIL, just check, are the students producing language, and are they all engaged? Are they all doing something what you want them to do? And are they producing language? If that's 2 yeses, then you're doing CLIL. So don't overcomplicate it. And the other thing is that I've been working with teachers worldwide for years now with the online CLIL Summit and CLIL Magazine, and I still see a lot of teachers reinventing the wheel because they're often, they want to try out new things, and that's often been done in other countries as well. So in the ideal world, I would like every CLIL teacher to ask for help or find that they are not the only one struggling, and be open to that. And I've talked with teachers from Australia to America to Russia to Africa, Scandinavia, it's Italy, Spain, all teachers all over the world, and they all have the same challenge. They all struggle with getting students to speak English, for example. So if there's one thing that I hope for the future is that those CLIL teachers teaching bilingual education throughout the world get in touch, find each other, and get support, and that way hopefully feel sometimes a little bit less lonely if they're one of the only ones in their schools offering this type of education.
Yeah, you mentioned that. You talked about, teachers collaborating more. And yes, I think as teachers, we do need to collaborate more. That was one of the messages that I'd taken also from a conference that I was at the weekend. We don't collaborate with each other enough. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our show. Thank you so much, Patrick, for your time. It has been a pleasure as always speaking with you. We will be in touch. And if any of you listening in are interested in joining Teachers Talk Radio as a host, please do visit our website on www.ttradio.org. We'd love to hear from you. Patrick and everybody else listening, have a good rest of your day, good evening, good rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.